My name is Katherine Voss. I'm 29 years old, and I work as a paralegal at a small firm in Columbus. Lakeview Paralegal Group, 3 attorneys, 11 clients on retainer, and a caseload that requires the kind of systematic patience that most people don't think to list as a skill. I handle contracts, correspondence, and the quiet logistics that keep cases from falling apart at procedural seams. I am good at reading documents carefully and saying very little about what I find in them. I was trained for that early, though not in any classroom. I drove 40 minutes to my mother's house in Crestfield, Ohio that Sunday evening because she'd called and said it had been too long. Her voice on the phone had a particular warmth in it, the warmth she applied when she needed something she hadn't named yet, a warmth that operated like a hand on your shoulder guiding you somewhere you hadn't agreed to go. I'd learned to recognize it at roughly age 12. I still answered when she called. The drive itself was unremarkable in the way that familiar routes are. Exits I could take without checking signs, a stretch of state road where the shoulder widens near a grain elevator I've been passing for 6 years. I thought, on the drive, about what I would say if she asked about work, about whether I would mention the Fairchild contract I'd spent 11 days on, and I decided I wouldn't. There was a particular version of interest my mother expressed in my work. Brief, polite, redirected. That was worse, in its way, than no interest at all. I had stopped trying to bridge that gap. I drove and I listened to the radio and I did not practice anything. I brought a bottle of sparkling water and a store-bought pie from Herschel's on 5th because I had learned through 2 decades of trial that arriving empty-handed produced a specific kind of sigh and arriving with too much produced a different kind. The pie was their honey peach, Taylor's favorite since we were kids, even though Taylor's eating habits had changed 3 times since then and I wasn't sure she still ate honey peach. I bought it anyway. The table was already set when I got there. My sister Taylor was in the kitchen with her fiancé, Derek, their voices overlapping in that easy, loud way couples have when they're performing togetherness for a third party. My mother, Diane, stood at the stove with her back to me, a dish towel folded over one shoulder, stirring something in the ceramic pot she'd owned since before I was born. She didn't turn around when I came through the door. "Close it all the way," she said. "Draft gets in." I closed the door. I set the sparkling water on the counter and the pie beside it. The kitchen smelled of reheated pot roast and something faintly scorched at the bottom of the dish, the kind of smell that meant the pot had been on too long. A serving spoon scraped across the ceramic bottom when she stirred, a flat metallic sound that carried into the dining room. I sat down at the table. Derek nodded at me with the mild goodwill of a person who is making an effort. Taylor looked up from her phone, smiled in the direction of my left shoulder, and looked back down. The centerpiece was the same arrangement of fake sunflowers my mother had kept on the dining room table for 15 years, their fabric petals still holding their original yellow in a way that real flowers don't. It was Sunday, 6:47 p.m. I had been in the house for 4 minutes, and I had not yet said a word that anyone had responded to. The label came before I was old enough to argue with it, which is the most efficient way to install one. I was the second daughter, 4 years behind Taylor, and in our house that meant I had arrived after the family story was already written and the roles already cast. Taylor was sharp and quick and social in the way that teachers remember, the kind of child who raises her hand and is right, who gets called on without having to wait. I was quieter and more uncertain in public, which my mother read not as temperament but as deficiency. By the time I was in middle school, the word useless had appeared in enough contexts. Half joking at dinner, exasperated in the car, casually and without apparent malice in front of neighbors, that I had stopped flinching at it. That's the mechanism of a repeated label. You don't adopt it exactly, but you stop spending energy on the fight. You just go quiet. You wait for the moment to pass. You get good at waiting. My father left when I was 15. He didn't leave with drama. No argument that I heard, no scene in the kitchen, no moment I could point to afterward and say, "That's when it happened." He just stopped coming home at his usual hour, and then stopped coming home by 9, and then one morning I woke up and his car was gone from the driveway, and my mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her and a face that had shut itself like a window being latched. She didn't cry in front of us. She said, "We'll manage," and she looked at Taylor when she said it. I was standing 2 feet to Taylor's left. I registered the direction of her gaze the way you register something you can't unhear. I filed it in a place I didn't name. Taylor went to college on a partial scholarship and the remains of our mother's savings. She graduated in 4 years, got engaged to Derek in the 5th, and took a marketing position in Cleveland that involved a lot of travel she posted about. She called home every Sunday. She sent photos of restaurants, of sunsets, of the two of them in airports. She was the version of daughter that my mother could describe to her church friends without editing anything out or lowering her voice. I went to community college, then a paralegal certification program, then a string of small firms where I learned the work before I found one worth staying at. I didn't call every Sunday. I didn't send photos. I was not the story my mother told. What I was, beginning when I was 24 and continuing for the next 3 years without announcement or acknowledgement, was the person who kept the finances from collapsing. My mother's debt was not the result of one catastrophe. That would have been a cleaner story, one medical crisis, one bad investment, one thing to point to. The reality was more ordinary and more corrosive. It had accumulated over years of decisions made when money felt slightly more flexible than it was. The second mortgage had been refinanced at a rate that made sense in the year she'd taken it and didn't make sense in the years that followed. A credit line opened for Taylor's wedding venue deposit had been used for the deposit and then kept open and used for 4 other things over 14 months. Medical bills from a procedure in 2022, a procedure that was not an emergency but had become necessary, had been partially covered by insurance in the way that insurance covers things partially, leaving a balance that she'd been making minimum payments on for nearly a year. Each one, individually, was manageable. Together, they had become a sum that was consuming a significant portion of her monthly income in interest alone. I found out the scale of it on a January afternoon 3 years ago when I was visiting, and the mail was stacked on the kitchen counter, and I picked up the wrong envelope. The return address was from the mortgage servicer. The envelope was already open, she'd read it and set it down on top of the stack, and the flap had drifted back. I wasn't snooping. The paper was just there, partially visible. I sat down at the kitchen table with it and I read it twice. She was not home. I had 20 minutes before she was due back from the pharmacy. I put the statement back in the envelope. I set it on the stack exactly where I'd found it. And I sat there in the quiet of her kitchen, looking at the sunflowers on the table, understanding something about the mathematics of our family that I had sensed for years without having the specific figure to attach to it. I didn't say anything to her about it when she got home. I didn't offer, didn't sit her down, didn't frame it as a conversation. I knew what that would produce. First the denial, warm and automatic, then the pride, then a version of gratitude that would require me to minimize what I was doing until it felt like nothing. I'd watched her accept help from Taylor in the one form Taylor offered it. Presence, attention, Sunday calls, and I knew that what I had to offer was different in kind and would not land the same way. So I didn't have the conversation. I just started sending money. Not a fixed amount every month, because a fixed amount would have been noticed and named and turned into something it couldn't sustain being. An amount calibrated each month against what I knew was owed, what was coming due, what I could transfer without destabilizing my own footing. Some months it was $1,600. Some months it was $2,100. Averaged over 27 months, it came to $1,870 per month. The total, when the last balance cleared, was $50,340. I kept records. A manila folder, rubber-banded, with a county office stamp on the upper left corner where I'd requested a lien verification once just to confirm the payoff math. Inside, 27 transfer confirmations, each one with a date, an amount, and a payee note I'd typed in myself. Katherine Voss, debt assist. I kept it in the bottom of my work bag, then later in a drawer. What I gave up to keep giving was not dramatic, but it was specific. There was an apartment in German Village I had found on a Saturday afternoon walk. Wide plank oak floors, a second bedroom with east-facing light, a building with a small courtyard. The rent would have pushed my monthly math past the point where I could keep the transfers going. I saved the listing and I didn't call the number. The listing expired after 30 days. There were 3 work conferences I declined to attend, and I was vague about why. There was a summer where a colleague offered to split costs on a shared vacation house for a week in July, and I said I'd think about it and then quietly let the window close. There was a version of my life I was holding slightly to the side, not abandoned, just deferred, the way you hold a door open for someone who's taking longer than expected. I kept telling myself there was a bottom to the debt. Once it cleared, I'd stop deferring. I did not calculate that the label would still be in use after the debt was gone. Dinner moved the way it always did when Derek was present. It organized itself around Taylor. The wedding was 4 months out. The venue in Cleveland had confirmed the catering package. Taylor's dress was at the seamstress for its second fitting. Derek's parents were flying in from Phoenix and staying for a long weekend. The photographer had a whole outdoor setup that Taylor pulled up on her phone and held out for my mother's inspection. "Look at that light," Taylor said. "That's beautiful," my mother said, leaning in. "That's exactly what I pictured from the beginning." I passed the serving dish without being asked, and no one acknowledged it. I took a portion and set the dish back down in the center, and nobody had been waiting on it. The conversation turned, as these conversations do, to the division of logistics. My mother listed 3 things she was contributing: the centerpieces, the wedding favors, a specific type of ribbon she'd sourced from a shop in Westerville. Derek's family was covering the rehearsal dinner, full stop. Taylor's work friends were handling the bachelorette trip, already planned for Nashville. There was a pause in the inventory. Taylor looked at me. "Are you doing anything?" she asked. "Like, a contribution to the weekend?" "I can help with setup," I said. "Day of logistics, whatever needs coordinating." Taylor nodded in the way that means noted and not waited. She looked back at her phone. "Set up," my mother said, and the word had a particular flatness in it. I looked at her. "Is that funny?" I asked. "It's not funny," she said. "It's just," she set her fork down. The sound it made against the plate was small and exact. "You know what your problem is, Katherine? You've never actually done anything. Not really. Not for this family." She was looking at her plate still, rearranging the potatoes at the edge with the tines of her fork. "You show up. You take up space. You drift through things." "Mom," Taylor said. The word had no weight behind it. "I mean it." Diane looked up. Her voice was level, not raised, not sharp, the cruelty entirely in the temperature. "You have always been this way. Since you were young. Useless. You're useless trash, Katherine, and I don't know what else to call it because that's what it is. I look at you sometimes and I wonder where it comes from." Something went cold across the back of my shoulders. Not rage, not the old familiar shrinking, something that had been waiting, specifically and quietly, for a very long time. The room held still. Derek looked at his plate. Taylor set her phone down face down, a gesture that in another context would have been comforting. The gravy in the serving dish had started to skin over at the surface. "Useless," my mother said again, quieter, the way you say a word a second time to confirm you meant it. The silence after that was 3 full seconds. "I know because I counted without choosing to." "You've been saying that word for a long time," I said. "Because it applies," she replied. "Taylor carries this family. Always has. You're here and then you're not, and nothing is different either way." I met her eyes, steady. I did not answer right away. "I'm ungrateful," I said. Still not a question. "Deeply," she said. "That's another word that applies. Deeply ungrateful. You take everything this family offers and you give nothing back. You always have." "What does this family offer me?" I asked. She looked at me with the particular patience she used when she thought a question didn't deserve engagement. "A home. A table. A family that would do anything for you." "Okay," I said. Taylor said quietly, "Katherine." "I'm not leaving," I said. "I just need a minute." I stood up from the table. I carried my glass to the kitchen. I set it in the sink. I turned the tap until the water ran cold. I held my hands under it. I turned it off. I dried my hands on the dish towel hanging from the oven handle. I walked back through the doorway and stopped at the end of the hall. I looked at my coat on the hook by the door. I looked at the back of the dining room, at the three of them visible in the gap between the hall wall and the door frame. I reached into my coat pocket. I took out my phone. I opened the banking app. I navigated to the account history. I found the transfer log. I scrolled back to the first entry, dated 27 months ago. I held the phone screen facing me and I stood there reading the list from beginning to end. Then I walked back toward the dining room. They hadn't moved. My mother had resumed eating. Taylor had her phone in her hand again but wasn't looking at it. Derek was examining the centerpiece with the focused attention of a man who has learned when to disappear from a conversation. I stopped at the edge of the table. I reached into my coat pocket and I took out my phone. I set it on the table, face up, screen still live in front of my mother's plate. She looked at it the way you look at an object someone has placed near you that you haven't been asked to touch. I opened the transfer history to the first entry. I rotated the phone so the screen faced her, the full log visible. 27 entries, each with a date, each with a dollar amount, each with the payee note I had typed in myself. I lay my palm flat beside the phone on the tablecloth. That's 27 months, I said. The average was $1,870 a month. The total is $50,340. Nobody spoke. That's the second mortgage balance, I said. The medical bills from 2022. The credit line that kept rolling. I didn't tell you I was covering it because I knew what would happen if I did. I've watched this family long enough to know. My mother stared at the screen. She didn't reach for the phone. She didn't push it away. Her face was doing something I didn't have a word for. Not guilt exactly, not surprise exactly, something that looked like a person reorganizing a story they'd been telling themselves for a long time. She started. I'm not asking for acknowledgement, I said. I want you to look at that screen and then tell me where useless comes from. Tell me where gives nothing back comes from. Say it to me specifically. She looked at the screen for a long moment. I didn't know, she said. No, I said. You didn't ask. Taylor said, I didn't know either, Katherine. I looked at her. She had both hands in her lap, the phone face down on the table beside her untouched plate, and there was something in the set of her shoulders. Not remorse exactly, not yet, but the beginning of recalculation. Taylor processed things that way, inventory first, then feeling. I'd watched her do it since we were children, and I had never held it against her. What I felt now was something closer to a flat, even exhaustion, the kind that settles in after a long effort has finally been named, not the end of something but the specific weight of it being seen. I know, I said. And that was the truth. Fix, named emotion, angry, removed, replaced. Taylor's failure had its own shape. Different from my mother's, smaller, less deliberate, and I had never made it her weight to carry. Derek cleared his throat once and then said nothing, which was the correct choice. You called me useless trash, I said to my mother. At your dinner table. In front of Derek. Because Taylor asked if I was contributing to a wedding. I paused. I have been contributing to this family for 3 years. Quietly. Without announcement. Without anyone asking or noticing. Diane's hands were flat on the tablecloth. Not gripping anything. Just resting there, very still. You said I take everything and give nothing back, I said. You said that in front of witnesses. I need you to understand what the record shows, specifically, and then I need you to never use that word about me again. In any room. For any reason. That's what I'm asking. I picked up the phone. I put it back in my coat pocket. The pie is from Herschel's, I said. It's honey peach. Taylor's always liked their crust. I picked up my jacket from the hook. I put it on. I opened the front door all the way. I let the draft in because I was leaving and the draft could take care of itself, and I closed it behind me. 6 months later, I signed the lease on the apartment in German Village. The floors were wide plank oak, worn smooth along the path between the kitchen and the front window the way wood gets when people have lived well in a space for a long time. The second bedroom became the office I'd pictured. Desk against the east wall, morning light coming in flat and without ceremony, which is the best kind of light for working by. The first morning I sat at that desk, I opened my laptop and I did not open a transfer log or a lien statement or any document that had anything to do with my mother's house. I opened the Fairchild contract from the previous week, and I worked for 3 hours, and the only interruption was a blue jay that landed on the courtyard ledge outside the window and sat there for a while before deciding against staying. The folder lives in the top drawer of my filing cabinet. Rubber-banded, the county stamp envelope on top, 27 months of transfer confirmations organized chronologically inside. I don't open it often. But I know its weight, the specific thickness of 3 years of paper, and knowing it's there is enough. It sits differently than an old debt does, quieter, more certain, the way settled things tend to. My mother called once, on a Thursday evening about 6 weeks after the dinner. I was at my desk. I watched her name appear on the screen and I set the phone face down and let it ring through to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. That told me what I needed to know about whether she had found words that were worth saying. Taylor texted a week before the wedding. She said she wished I was going to be there. I wrote back that I hoped the photographer captured that outdoor light she'd shown me at dinner. I meant it genuinely. Taylor's happiness had never been the thing I was working against. I have a Tuesday dinner now with a colleague named Priya who laughs at things I say in the dry, tired voice I use at the end of long days, and who treats my observations as if they were worth having, which is a new experience I am still getting calibrated to. I run the trail along Goodale Park on Saturday mornings. I am learning, with patience, that taking up space and being useless are two different measurements, that one was invented for me and one is a fact, and that only one of them was ever real. The folder in the drawer is not a trophy. It is a record of work done, labor logged, amounts specific, dates exact. Most things that matter come down to something like that eventually. Work. Evidence. Paper that doesn't require anyone to believe you. If something in this story found you, if you've been the one who gave quietly, who kept the family standing while being told you were dead weight, share it with someone who needs to hear that the record exists. Someone always kept it.